The security camera footage from NBC Studios Burbank captured it at exactly 6:14 in the evening. On a Tuesday in December of 1977, Frank Sinatra, the most powerful voice in the history of American popular music, was standing up from the guest chair on the Tonight Show stage while the cameras were still rolling. He was not being escorted out. He was not being asked to leave. He was not having a medical emergency. He was simply standing, and then he was walking. And the direction he was walking was away from the desk, away from Johnny Carson, away from the 310 people sitting in absolute silence in that studio, and toward the curtained exit at the back of the stage. Nobody moved to stop him. Nobody in the control room gave an order. The director, a man named Fred de Cordova who had worked every major moment of The Tonight Show for 14 years, simply stared at his monitors and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Because what had just happened on that stage was something that had never happened in the history of that program, and the reason it had happened was sitting on Johnny Carson's desk in plain view of 40 million people who were watching from their living rooms that night, and had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. That thing on the desk was a vinyl record, a single. The original pressing of Love Me Tender by Elvis Presley, released in September of 1956. The sleeve was worn at the corners, the kind of wear you get not from carelessness, but from years of being picked up and set down and picked up again by someone who could not quite decide what to do with it. On the back of the sleeve, in handwriting that was immediately recognizable to anyone who had ever seen it, were 12 words. 12 words that Elvis Presley had written in the spring of 1960, 17 years before Frank Sinatra stood up from that chair and walked off the most watched television program in America without a word of explanation. And what those 12 words said, and why Frank Sinatra could not sit still long enough to let Johnny Carson read them aloud on camera, is a story that begins not in 1960 and not in 1977, but in 1957, on the night Frank Sinatra said something in a newspaper interview that would define the relationship between two of the most famous men in the history of American music for the rest of their lives. And it is a story that nobody, not the producers, not the audience, not even the people who were there that December night, knew the full truth of until Frank Sinatra walked back through that curtain 23 minutes later and sat down across from Johnny Carson, and finally, for the first time in his life, said it out loud. But before we get into what happened in that hallway, and what Frank Sinatra said when he came back, and what those 12 words actually were, I want to take a moment to say something directly to you. I see messages in the comments every single week from people who have been watching this channel for months and never realized they were not subscribed. If these stories have meant something to you, please take 30 seconds right now and check. It costs nothing. It keeps these stories alive. Thank you for being here. And now, let us go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened on that December night in 1977, you have to understand what happened 20 years before it, in a world that barely remembers it was ever this divided. The year was 1957, and Frank Sinatra was 41 years old, and at the absolute peak of a career that had already survived more near deaths than any musician in living memory. He had lost his contract with Columbia Records in 1952. His voice had hemorrhaged from a blood clot on his vocal cord. His marriage to Ava Gardner had collapsed in the most public and painful way possible. By 1953, the consensus in Hollywood was that Frank Sinatra was finished, and then, in the single greatest comeback in the history of American entertainment, he had won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor in From Here to Eternity, signed with Capitol Records, made a series of albums with Nelson Riddle that would be recognized decades later as the greatest recordings in the history of the American popular song, and rebuilt himself into something even larger than what he had been before. By 1957, Frank Sinatra was not just a singer, he was an institution. He was the arbiter of taste, the definition of cool, the man whose opinion about music, about culture, about what was worth taking seriously, carried the weight of a cultural verdict. And in the fall of 1957, a reporter for a trade publication asked him about rock and roll. What Sinatra said in that interview was not casual. He chose his words deliberately, the way he always chose his words, and the words he chose were devastating. He called rock and roll the most brutal, ugly, vicious form of expression it has been my displeasure to hear. He called it sung, played, and written, for the most part, by cretinous goons. He said it managed to be the martial music of every sideburn delinquent on the face of the earth. And then, in the line that would be reprinted in every article about Elvis Presley written for the next 20 years, he called it a rancid-smelling aphrodisiac. The year Elvis Presley turned 22, Frank Sinatra used his platform, his reputation, and the full force of his cultural authority to tell the world that Elvis Presley's music was garbage and that the people who made it were goons. Elvis Presley read the interview. He was in his dressing room in Memphis when someone handed him the clipping. The people around him at the time said he read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in his jacket pocket without saying a word. He did not respond publicly. He did not give a counter-interview. He did not call Sinatra out on stage or in the press. He was 22 years old, and he had just been called a cretinous goon by the most respected musician in America, and he said nothing. But what nobody knew, and what would not be known until years after both men were dead, is what Elvis did with that interview clipping. He kept it. He put it in a manila envelope in a drawer in his home in Memphis, and every time someone handed him a bad review, or a dismissive write-up, or a piece saying he was fading or his time was over, he added it to that envelope, and on the envelope he wrote 3 words. "Still here, Frank." 3 words that nobody ever saw until the envelope was found in the contents of Graceland after his death. Still here, Frank? Now. The year is 1960. Elvis Presley has just returned from 22 months in the United States Army, stationed in West Germany, during which time he had done no recording, no performing, no public appearances of any kind beyond what was required of him as a private, and then a sergeant in the U.S. Army. The music world had not waited for him. Fabian was on the charts. Bobby Darin was on the charts. The music press was asking whether Elvis's moment had passed, whether he had gone in as a phenomenon and would come out as a nostalgia act. And into this uncertainty, at the peak of his cultural authority, Frank Sinatra made a phone call. He called Elvis Presley's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, and he offered Elvis a spot on his television special, Frank Sinatra's Welcome Home Party for Elvis Presley, broadcast on ABC, expected to be the most watched television event of the year. Nobody in the music business could believe it. The same man who had called rock and roll a rancid aphrodisiac was offering Elvis Presley the biggest possible platform at the most important moment of his career. The gossip columnists wrote about it for weeks. Was it a publicity stunt? Was Sinatra trying to absorb Elvis's audience? Was there some deal behind the scenes that nobody was talking about? The speculation was everywhere, and neither Sinatra nor Elvis said a word to clarify it. The special aired on May 12, 1960. 40 million people watched. Elvis wore a tuxedo. Sinatra wore a tuxedo. They shook hands on camera, and the image of those 2 hands clasped together was on the front page of every newspaper in the country the next morning. And then, in a moment that the music world talked about for decades afterward, they performed each other's songs. Sinatra sang "Love Me Tender." Elvis sang "Witchcraft." The king of the Rat Pack and the king of rock and roll stood on the same stage and sang each other's music in front of 40 million Americans, and in doing so told the world that the war between them was over. But it was what happened after the cameras stopped that night that nobody knew about. The crew was breaking down the set. The musicians were packing up their instruments. The other guests were gathered in small groups near the exits, waiting for their cars. Frank Sinatra was standing near the back of the stage when Elvis crossed the room toward him. Not with an entourage, not with Colonel Parker. Alone. He walked up to Sinatra, and he leaned in close, and he said something very quietly, something that only Sinatra could hear, and then he straightened up, nodded once, and walked away. Sinatra stood there for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out through the back of the studio without speaking to anyone else. The next morning, when Sinatra arrived at his home in Los Angeles, he found something waiting for him. It had been delivered by courier overnight. It was a vinyl record. "Love Me Tender," the original pressing, in a sleeve with a note in Elvis's handwriting. Sinatra opened it, read it, and did not speak about it. He did not tell anyone what it said. He put the record in a box in his home office, and it stayed there for the next 17 years. Through the rest of Elvis's career, through the divorces and the scandals and the Las Vegas years, and the weight and the prescription drugs and the slow decline that everyone around Elvis could see, and nobody seemed able to stop. Through all of it, Sinatra kept that record, and he never spoke about what was written on the back of the sleeve. Not to his friends, not to his children, not to the press, not to anyone, until the night he walked off the Tonight Show stage and spent 23 minutes in a hallway with Johnny Carson, trying to decide whether he was going to go back out there and say it out loud for the first time. Wait. Do not miss what just happened here, because the story of how that record ended up on Johnny Carson's desk that December night is itself a story that has never been fully told. And it begins not with Sinatra or with Elvis, but with a phone call that Johnny Carson received 4 months earlier, in August of 1977, 2 days after Elvis Presley died. The call came on a Thursday morning. Johnny was in his office at NBC reviewing notes for the week's tapings. His assistant knocked and said there was a call from Los Angeles, and that the caller had given his name but asked her not to announce it. Johnny took the call, and what he heard in the first 30 seconds made him put down his coffee cup and not pick it up again for the rest of that morning. The caller was Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra, calling 2 days after the death of Elvis Presley, had a request. He told Johnny that there was something he had been holding on to for 17 years. He said he had been thinking about whether and how and when to talk about it publicly, and that Elvis's death had made the question feel urgent in a way it had not before. He said he was not ready to say everything he needed to say, but he thought Carson's show might be the right place to say some of it. He asked whether Carson could find a way to work it into an appearance sometime in the fall. And then, before he hung up, he told Carson about the record. He said there was a record he was going to bring with him. He said it was something Elvis had given him, and he said he wanted Carson to have it on the desk when the conversation got to the right moment, because Sinatra was not sure he would be able to produce it himself without losing his composure, and he wanted it to come from Carson rather than from him. Johnny Carson hung up the phone and sat in his office for a long time. He called the record a prop once, in a note he made to himself that evening. And then he crossed the word out and wrote object instead. They scheduled the appearance for the second Tuesday in December, 4 months after Elvis died, roughly a year after Sinatra's last major public appearance. The pre-show conversation between Carson and Sinatra lasted 45 minutes in Johnny's dressing room the afternoon of the taping. By the time they walked out, both men had red eyes, and the stage manager made a note that neither of them touched the coffee that had been brought in. Now, the things Johnny Carson knew going into that taping that the audience did not know. First, Sinatra had not spoken publicly about Elvis's death since it happened. Not a statement, not an interview, not a comment to a columnist, nothing. Second, the record was on the desk, placed there by a production assistant 90 minutes before taping began, face down so the handwriting was visible to anyone who came close, but not readable from a distance. Third, Sinatra had told Carson during the pre-show conversation that he was not certain he would be able to finish the story once he started it, and that if he could not, he wanted Carson to read the back of the sleeve aloud himself. And fourth, there was something on that sleeve that Sinatra had never told anyone, including his children, including his closest friends, including Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr., the two men he was closer to than any other human beings alive. 12 words. That is all there was. But what those 12 words said, and what they meant to a man who had spent 20 years believing one thing about the night he had offered Elvis Presley the biggest break of his post-army career, had the power to change the entire story of who Frank Sinatra was and why he had done what he did. And it was only on the night of December 1977, sitting across from Johnny Carson with the record on the desk between them, that Sinatra finally understood the full weight of what he was carrying. But wait, because there is something you have not been told yet. And it is the detail that makes everything else make sense. When Frank Sinatra called Johnny Carson 2 days after Elvis died and told him about the record, he said something at the very end of that conversation that he said as though it were a footnote, a small thing, something barely worth mentioning. He said that in all the years he had kept that record in his office, he had never turned it over. He had put it in the box sleeve side up the day it arrived, and he had never once flipped it to see the front. He had kept it all those years without ever looking at the record itself, not because he was afraid of it, because he already knew what the record was. He did not need to see the label. He did not need to see Elvis's face on the sleeve. He knew what was in his hands, but he had kept it sleeve side up, with the handwriting facing him, for 17 years, because those 12 words were the thing. Those 12 words were why the record was there at all. Now, I want to talk to you for a moment before we go further. This channel runs entirely on the support of the people watching it. No sponsors, no brand deals, just you. If you want to be part of keeping these stories alive, consider joining the membership. Become one of the people keeping these forgotten stories alive. Tap join and see what's waiting inside. The link is in the description. And now back to December 1977, to a Tuesday evening, to a studio in Burbank. To the moment when 310 people in a television studio and 40 million people watching at home saw something they had never seen before and would not see again. The taping began at 5:30 in the evening. Johnny's monologue was technically flawless. The timing was perfect. If you had been watching from home that night, the first 15 minutes of the program looked exactly like every other Tuesday night. Carson made his jokes. The audience laughed. Ed McMahon chuckled from his position at the left of the desk. And everything proceeded with the smooth mechanical regularity of a program that had been running for 15 years and knew exactly how to look like it was effortless. But Ed McMahon, who knew Johnny Carson's rhythms better than almost any living person, could see that something was different. Johnny's right hand, resting on the desk during the monologue, was not entirely still, not visibly, not in a way the cameras would catch or the audience would notice. But Ed had been watching that hand for 15 years, and he knew what it looked like when Johnny was managing something beneath the surface of a performance. At the first commercial break, Ed leaned in. "You all right?" Johnny looked at him. "In a little while, Ed, something's going to happen on this stage that I need you to let go. Do not cut away. Do not signal for a break. Whatever happens, let it happen." Ed started to ask why. Johnny said, "Trust me." The cameras went back on. At 6:03 in the evening, Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio. The introduction was simple, almost understated, which was itself unusual. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a man who needs no introduction. Mr. Frank Sinatra." The audience response was immediate and enormous. Frank Sinatra walked through the curtain, wearing a tailored dark charcoal suit, a white dress shirt, a slim silver-gray tie, and a white pocket square folded with the precision of a man who had been dressing for audiences since 1935. His silver hair was combed back. His posture was what it always was, the posture of a man who had learned very early that the way you carried your body told the world everything it needed to know about whether you believed you had the right to be in the room. He shook Carson's hand, settled into the guest chair, and for the first 22 minutes, the conversation was exactly what the audience expected it to be. Old Hollywood, old friendships, a few well-calibrated stories from the Rat Pack years, the easy warmth of two men who had known each other for a long time and had no discomfort in each other's company. And then Johnny Carson's hand moved to the surface of the desk, and he turned the vinyl record over so that the front of the sleeve was now face down, and the back, the side with the handwriting, was facing up, visible to the cameras and to Sinatra and to every person in that room. Sinatra's eyes moved to it immediately. His posture changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that most people would have caught, but his right hand, which had been resting on the arm of the guest chair, moved to his knee, and the fingers closed slowly into something that was not quite a fist. He looked at the record for approximately 4 seconds. Then he looked at Carson. Johnny held his gaze and said nothing. He simply nodded, almost imperceptibly, the way you nod at someone to tell them, "It's time." What happened in the next 90 seconds is the reason that taping is still discussed in the television industry today. Sinatra looked at the record again. He reached for it. He picked it up. He held it for a moment, his hands still, and the studio was quiet enough that the slight crinkle of the cardboard sleeve when his fingers closed around it was audible on the broadcast recording. Then, without a word, without an explanation, Frank Sinatra stood up from the guest chair, set the record back on the desk, and walked off the stage. Nobody moved. Johnny Carson sat at his desk and watched him go. The audience sat in their seats and watched him go. The camera operators held their positions. Ed McMahon's expression did not change. And the record sat on the desk, face down, with those 12 words in Elvis Presley's handwriting facing the ceiling of NBC Studios Burbank on a Tuesday evening in December of 1977, while 40 million Americans watched the most powerful voice in the history of popular music walk into a hallway and disappear. Fred de Cordova, in the control room, said one sentence into his headset to the technical director. He said, "Stay on, Carson. Do not cut." And then he sat back and waited. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened in that hallway in the next 23 minutes. Because what Frank Sinatra did when the stage door closed behind him, what he said when Johnny Carson appeared in the hallway 45 seconds later, and what he finally admitted about that record, and about the night it was delivered, and about the 12 words he had been carrying for 17 years, is the part of this story that nobody in that studio knew, that nobody in the control room knew, and that nobody watching at home had any way to understand. Not yet. Carson was the only person who went after him. He had stood at his desk for 45 seconds. The record in front of him. The studio in complete silence. 300 people waiting. And then he had said to the camera something so simple and so direct that the broadcast team in the control room looked at each other in amazement. He said, Give me a minute. And then he stood up and walked off his own stage. The hallway behind the Tonight Show set was not glamorous. It was a working corridor, fluorescent lit, lined with equipment carts and cable bundles, and the kind of functional clutter that exists behind every television production in the world. Frank Sinatra was standing with his back against the wall near a fire door, his jacket still on, his hands in his pockets. He was not crying. He was not shaking. He was simply standing there in the way that a man stands when he has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally set it down and does not yet know what it feels like to be without it. Carson stood in front of him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Frank, what do you need?" And Sinatra looked at him and said something that Carson would quote in interviews for the rest of his life. He said, "I need you to understand what it is I'm about to do, because once I say this out loud, on camera, in front of everyone, it becomes a different kind of true. It becomes the kind of true that I can't take back. And I have been deciding for 17 years whether I want it to be that kind of true. And I still don't know." Carson said, "What are you afraid of?" And Sinatra said, "That I'll say it, and people will think it's easy. That they'll hear it and think, well, it was obvious. Of course you felt that way. Of course it meant that much. And they won't understand what it cost. Because they won't know what I thought it was all those years. They'll hear what it is, and they won't know what I thought I was hearing." Carson waited. He had learned, over 15 years of interviewing every kind of person in every kind of emotional state, that the most important thing you can do when someone is standing at the edge of something they have never said out loud is simply to remain in the room, not to prompt, not to reassure, not to explain, simply to stay. And so he stayed. And after a moment, Sinatra reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and he pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was yellow with age, the fold lines soft from having been opened and closed many times. He unfolded it. He held it so that Carson could see it but not read it. And he said, "When Elvis whispered to me that night, after the cameras went off, in 1960, I heard him say, 'You were right about everything.' That's what I thought," he said. "For 17 years, I believed that he had come up to me after the most watched moment in music that year and whispered that I was right. That rock and roll was what I said it was. That the whole thing was a fad, that I had been correct to say what I said in 1957. Carson said nothing. Sinatra folded the paper again and put it back in his pocket. And then he said, "The record arrived the next morning. I read the 12 words, and I thought, this is confirmation. He sent me this record as a thank you. And on the back he wrote something that confirmed what he had whispered, and I put it in a box and I left it there, and I felt, for 17 years, that what I had done for him in 1960 was a kind of grace, a kind of forgiveness from above. I came down from my position and offered my hand, and he was grateful." He stopped. The fluorescent lights in the hallway hummed. From somewhere behind the set wall came the muffled sound of the orchestra warming up a second time. And then about 2 weeks after Elvis died, Sinatra said, "I was going through some things in my office, and I found the record in the box where I had put it. And for the first time in 17 years, I turned it over." He paused again. "I had been keeping it handwriting side up. I had never looked at the front, not once. I took it out, and I turned it over, and I looked at the label on the record, and I realized I had never actually looked at which pressing it was. And the pressing was the original, 1956. Before I said anything, before the interview, before I called it a rancid aphrodisiac and called him a goon and told 40 million people that what he was doing was garbage, he sent me a copy of the record from before I ever tried to destroy him." Carson let that sit in the air of the hallway for a long moment. And then he said, "What did the 12 words say, Frank?" Sinatra looked at the fire door. He looked at the ceiling. And then he looked at Carson and said, "I kept it because I thought it said what I told myself it said. But when I turned it over and I saw the original pressing, I read it again, and this time I understood what I had actually been holding for 17 years. He already knew. When he came up to me in 1960, he did not whisper that I was right. He whispered the opposite. He said, 'I forgave you before we ever shook hands.'" Johnny Carson said nothing for a long time. The hallway was completely still. If you've made it this far in this story, please take a second to hit the like button. It takes one tap, and it means everything to channels like this one that rely entirely on the community to keep going. And now, back to the hallway. Back to the 23 minutes. Because what happened next, what Frank Sinatra said when he finally walked back through that curtain and sat down in front of the cameras and the audience and the 40 million people who had been waiting in their living rooms, is the part of this story that the people who were there that night say they will never forget for as long as they live. They stood in that hallway for 11 more minutes. Carson did not tell Sinatra what to do. He did not give him a plan or a script or a reassurance about how the audience would receive what he was about to say. He simply stood there and waited. And at some point during those 11 minutes, Sinatra took the folded yellow paper out of his jacket pocket again and opened it and read it one more time. And whatever he read in that moment, whatever he found there that he had been returning to for 17 years without ever quite hearing it correctly, was the thing that decided it. He folded the paper, put it back in his pocket, straightened his tie with the automatic precision of a man who has been straightening ties for cameras since 1935, and said to Carson, "All right, let's go back." The moment Sinatra reappeared through the curtain, the studio audience rose. Not with the explosive immediate applause of excitement, with the slow, almost uncertain applause of people who had just watched something happen that they did not fully understand and needed to express what they felt before they could make sense of it. Sinatra did not acknowledge the applause. He walked directly to the guest chair, sat down, and looked at the record on the desk. He looked at it for approximately 3 seconds. Then he picked it up. He held it in both hands, the sleeve facing outward, and he turned it slowly so that the handwriting was visible to the camera. And for the first time in 17 years, what Elvis Presley had written on the back of the Love Me Tender sleeve in the spring of 1960 was visible to the world. "You were right about the music. You were wrong about the man." That was it. That was the 12 words. 8 in the first sentence, 4 in the second. Separated by a period. No signature. No date. No explanation. Just 12 words that said everything and nothing, and changed the meaning of 17 years in one moment. The studio did not react immediately. There was a lag, the way there is always a lag when something true is said in a public place. The moment where the truth enters the room and has to find somewhere to settle before the people in the room can respond to it. And then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, a man started to cry. Not loudly, just a sharp, involuntary intake of breath that became something else. And within 30 seconds the sound had moved through the studio in every direction, and 300 people were sitting in a television audience crying without any clear explanation for why. Sinatra set the record back on the desk. He did not speak immediately. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he said something that was almost impossible to hear on the broadcast because his voice was very quiet and very different from the voice he had been using for the first 22 minutes of the program. He said, "I thought he was telling me I was right. I spent 17 years believing that the man I called a cretinous goon had come back to me and confirmed my verdict. That I had been standing on the right side of history all along." He paused. "But he was not telling me I was right about the music. He was telling me I was wrong about the man. He was drawing a line between those two things and showing me that they are not the same thing, and that I had spent my entire career conflating them. You can be wrong about what someone makes and right about who they are. And you can be right about what someone makes and completely, catastrophically wrong about who they are." He looked at Carson. "I was wrong about who he was. I called him a goon when he was 22 years old, and I did not know him. I used every piece of authority I had built in this industry to tell the world he was beneath contempt, and he responded by spending 3 years in the army, and coming home and shaking my hand on camera, and performing my music, and sending me a record with 12 words that said, 'I know what you did, and I forgive you, and here is the line between the thing you said and the man I am.'" He stopped speaking. The studio was still, and then he said one more thing, the thing that Carson would say afterward was the reason he had been willing to wait in the hallway for 23 minutes. Sinatra said, "The worst thing I have ever done in my professional life is not the interview in 1957. The worst thing is that when he whispered to me in 1960, I heard what I wanted to hear instead of what he said. I stood there and let him offer me something extraordinary, and I turned it into a confirmation of myself, and I kept it for 17 years as a trophy. And all along, what I was keeping was a record of the most generous thing anyone has ever done for me." Carson leaned forward. He said very quietly, "And when did you know?" And Sinatra said, "When I turned the record over, when I saw the original pressing, when I understood that he had not gone out and bought a copy of his own record to send to me. This was his copy. the one he had been living with since 1956, the one that existed before I ever said a word against him. He reached into his life and took out the thing he was most famous for, the song that had made him, and he sent it to me to say, "This existed before you attacked it. This was real before your opinion of it, and I am telling you now, with this object, that your opinion of it did not change what it was." He was quiet for a moment. He sent me the record from before I tried to destroy him, and I turned it into a story about myself. The Tonight Show ran 41 minutes over its scheduled length that night. NBC received calls from every major newspaper in the country before the taping had finished broadcasting on the East Coast. The morning papers ran the story not in their entertainment sections, but on their front pages. Because what had happened was not a celebrity interview that went long. What had happened was a public reckoning with something that most people, in their private lives, understood deeply and had never heard said out loud on a television stage. The difference between being right about something and being right about someone. The difference between a verdict on a thing and a verdict on a person. The difference between winning an argument and understanding what the argument was actually about. The record stayed on Carson's desk for the rest of that taping. Nobody moved it. Sinatra did not take it with him when he left. Carson did not put it away. It sat on the desk through the final segment, through the credits, through the moment when the floor manager signaled the end of tape, and the studio lights shifted from broadcast color to work light. And it was still there, sitting on Johnny Carson's desk, in the changed light of the emptied studio, long after everyone else had gone. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998. He was 82 years old. Among the tributes and retrospectives that followed, the one that was quoted most frequently in the days after his death was not from a fellow musician or a film critic or a politician. It came from a brief handwritten statement released by the Tonight Show archive, which had kept a copy of the December 1977 taping in its permanent collection. The statement read, "In 1977, Frank Sinatra came onto this program, carrying something he had held for 17 years. He walked off the stage in the middle of the taping. He came back, and what he said when he returned is the reason this program has always believed that the most important television is not the television that shows you something perfect. It is the television that shows you something true." Elvis Presley was already gone by then. He had been gone for 21 years, but in the archive of that taping, on the back of a vinyl record that sat on a desk in a studio in Burbank on a Tuesday evening in December of 1977, 12 words remained exactly where they had always been. Not a verdict, not a confession, not an apology, just the cleanest possible articulation of the distance between the judgment we make of a person's work and the judgment we make of the person. 8 words and 4 words, separated by a period, written in the hand of a man who had every reason to be bitter and chose, instead, to be clear. You were right about the music. You were wrong about the man. Before you close this video, I want to ask you to do one thing. Think of someone in your life about whom you have formed a verdict. Not about what they do, about who they are. Think about whether those two things are actually the same thing. Whether what you believe about their work, their choices, their failures, the things that make you uncomfortable about them, is actually a verdict about them as a human being. Or whether, like Frank Sinatra in that hallway in 1977, you have been keeping a record for 17 years and hearing in it exactly what you wanted to hear. It is never too late to turn it over. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because these stories are reaching people everywhere, and I want to know where the truth is landing.